Brendan Holstrop, hands behind your back.
You brought how many for one lab tech? Wow, that's a lot of federal attention.
Brendan Holstrop kept his own records of every case he sold. Case number, attorney initials, contracted result, dollar amount, 1,412 entries, 5 years, in his own handwriting. Those records are now Exhibit A.
12 tampered drug analysis cases, $521,000 in payments through your Shell LLC.
RICO wire fraud evidence
6
tampering.
agents for 1 forensic analyst.
It would all come down to a composition book, spiral-bound, college-ruled, kept in the top drawer of a desk in a home office in suburban Baltimore. Inside, 5 years of entries. Case number, attorney initials, contracted result, dollar amount, a single check mark when the work was done. 1,412 rows. Every row, a drug case the state of Maryland believed it had won fairly. By the time federal agents finished cataloging it, the forensic chemist in this footage would be facing federal RICO charges, and 740 convictions across 3 Maryland counties would be marked unreliable. Pop quiz before we go further. How many drug cases do you think one forensic chemist can compromise before the system notices? Drop your number in the comments. Subscribe and find out if you were close. The real figure broke an entire county's prosecution record, and we're about to walk through every layer of how he did it. Brendan Thomas Holstrop was born in 1987 in Catonsville, Maryland, a working-class suburb on the western edge of Baltimore County, the kind of place where the strip malls fade into ranch houses, and the ranch houses fade into the Patapsco Valley State Park. His father was a high school physics teacher at Catonsville High School. His mother worked as a medical billing coder at the University of Maryland Medical Center downtown. He had one younger brother, Michael, 2 years his junior, and the 2 boys grew up in a split level on a cul-de-sac off Frederick Road, with a chain-link backyard and a basement that smelled permanently of cedar shavings from the rabbit hutch their father had built one summer and never dismantled. The teachers at Catonsville Elementary remembered him as quiet, not shy exactly, just self-contained. While the other kids organized themselves into the chaotic alliances of the lunchroom, he sat at the end of the bench and ate his sandwich and read whatever paperback he had brought from home. His 3rd grade report card called him a careful child with strong observational habits. His 6th grade report card noted that he works well independently and occasionally needs encouragement to participate in group activities. A pattern was visible early. It would still be visible 30 years later. The science came at him through his father. Phil Holstrop had taught physics at Catonsville High for 19 years by the time Brendan was old enough to understand what his father did for a living. And the dinner table conversations sometimes drifted into the kinds of explanations a physics teacher cannot quite shut off. Why ice floats, how a microwave actually works, why the moon looks bigger near the horizon. The science stuck in the way that domestic things stick. By 10th grade, he was placing 3rd in the regional science fair with a project on the rates of catalytic decomposition of hydrogen peroxide across different surface materials. By 12th grade, he had a 3.8 GPA and an early acceptance to the University of Maryland, College Park. He chose chemistry as his major in his 2nd semester, after a single conversation with an organic chemistry professor named Dr. Lynn, who had told him, in the offhand way that academic mentors sometimes change a young person's life, that he had the patience for the bench. It was meant as a compliment about temperament more than about technique. The bench rewards people who do not need to be interesting. He was one of them. He graduated in 2010 with a 3.7 GPA. The job market for newly minted chemistry bachelors was thin in the post-recession years, and the first position he could find was at a mid-size pharmaceutical contract manufacturer outside of Frederick. a quality control chemist at a starting salary of $41,000, running purity assays on generic formulation tablets and writing batch release reports in a corporate template that did not accept variation. He took it. He stayed 3 years. The pharma work was rigorous in a particular bureaucratic way. Every analytical procedure was governed by a written method. Every method was governed by a standard operating procedure. Every standard operating procedure was governed by an FDA regulation. The redundancy was the point. In pharmaceutical manufacturing, the analyst is never the last set of eyes, because the consequences of an undetected error are measured in human deaths. Brendan learned the rhythm of that environment. He also learned, in retrospect, what it felt like to work in a profession that does not trust the individual analyst alone. In 2017, he applied for a position at the Ashford County Regional Forensic Laboratory, a state-accredited facility operating out of a low brick building off Route 40, serving the prosecuting authorities of 3 Maryland counties. The starting salary was higher. The work was, on its face, similar. The credentialing was specific. An applicant needed a chemistry degree, 2 years of analytical experience, and willingness to pursue the American Board of Criminalistics drug analysis certification within the first 24 months of hire. He met every requirement. The hiring committee interviewed 11 candidates. They offered him the job within a week. His onboarding evaluation from the lab's senior analyst, written 4 months in, called him detail-oriented, methodically careful with chain of custody documentation, and one of the most technically competent junior analysts the lab has hired in recent years. A second evaluation, written at his 1-year mark, added that he works well independently and demonstrates a calm presence during high-volume periods. Both evaluations would later be entered into the federal indictment, not as evidence of his guilt, but as evidence of the institution's confidence, the kind of evaluations that, in hindsight, illustrate how completely the supervisory layer had been bypassed. He passed the ABC Drug Analysis Certification examination in 2018 on his first attempt. By 2019, he was carrying a caseload of roughly 300 drug analysis cases per year. By 2020, he had been promoted to senior analyst at a salary of $76,400 annually. He presented at the Mid-Atlantic Association of Forensic Scientists Regional Conference that fall on a paper titled Workflow Optimization in Mid-Volume Drug Identification Laboratories. 83 colleagues listened. The presentation was well received. He bought a 2-bedroom townhouse in a development in Owings Mills that same year. He lived alone. He had not been in a relationship since college. He attended Ravens games occasionally with his brother. He was, by every external measure available to the people who worked beside him, a competent man living a quiet life. That trust was about to be tested. To understand what Brendan Holstrop did, you have to understand what a forensic drug laboratory is supposed to do, and the gap between what it is supposed to do and what one analyst, alone at his bench, was actually able to do without anyone noticing. When a police officer in Maryland arrests a suspect for possession of a controlled substance, the substance itself is taken into evidence. A baggie of white powder, a sandwich bag of pills, a glass vial of liquid. The arresting agency seals the substance into an evidence envelope, assigns it a case number, and transports it under chain of custody protocol to the regional forensic laboratory that services that county. At the Ashford County Regional Forensic Laboratory, the envelope is logged in at the front intake desk, assigned to one of the lab's analysts, and queued for analysis. The analyst, and this is the point where the entire architecture begins to depend on a single person, then takes that sealed envelope to his bench. He opens it. He documents the contents. He removes a portion of the substance for testing. He runs the substance through a sequence of analytical procedures, a presumptive color test, a gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis to identify the chemical compound, a quantitative analysis to determine purity, and a weight measurement on a calibrated balance. He records every step in a case file. He writes a report. He signs the report. The report goes to the prosecutor. The prosecutor charges the case based on what the report says. That report is the foundational document of every drug prosecution in the state of Maryland. The prosecutor cites it in the charging document. The grand jury hears its conclusions. The defense attorney receives it in discovery. The judge admits it at trial. The defendant pleads or does not plead based on what it says. The translation of physical evidence into legally cognizable fact happens at exactly one point in the chain, and it happens in the hand of one person. The Ashford County Regional Forensic Laboratory had quality control protocols on paper. A second analyst was supposed to peer review a fixed percentage of cases. Calibration logs were supposed to be reviewed weekly. The lab supervisor was supposed to audit a sample of completed case files every quarter. All of these procedures existed. None of them, the federal indictment would later argue, were designed to catch what Holstrop was actually doing. Peer review checked the documentation. It did not retest the substance. The calibration log review checked that the instruments were operating within tolerance. It did not check whether the analyst had actually used the instrument the way the case file said he had. The quarterly audit pulled a small sample of cases and confirmed that the paperwork was complete. It did not pull the preserved sample from the evidence locker and run a confirmation analysis. The lab assumed honesty. The protocols assumed honesty. The downstream system, the prosecutor, the grand jury, the defense attorney, the judge, the defendant, the appellate courts, assumed honesty. The entire architecture of drug prosecution in 3 Maryland counties was built on the assumption that the analyst at the bench was telling the truth about what he had found. Brendan Holstrop was not telling the truth. The first compromise case the federal indictment was able to specifically identify occurred in the late spring of 2019. The defendant was a 23-year-old who had been arrested by Ashford County deputies in possession of what officers had field tested as cocaine, packaged in 2 separate baggies totaling approximately 140 grams, a quantity that, under Maryland statute, crossed the threshold for trafficking. Trafficking quantity meant a mandatory minimum sentence. The defendant's attorney, a man named in the federal indictment by his initials R.K., had a problem. R.K. solved the problem the way the federal indictment would later allege he solved many problems. He called Brendan Holstrop. The call was not made on official lines. It was made to a personal cell phone Holstrop maintained on a prepaid plan. The conversation was brief. R.K. confirmed that the case had been assigned to Holstrop's queue. Holstrop confirmed that he had received the evidence envelope. The price quoted was $1,200 for a weight reduction report, a report that would document the seized quantity as below the trafficking threshold. Holstrop took the case to his bench, weighed only a portion of the seized material, and recorded the partial weight as the total. The signed report went to the prosecutor. The trafficking charge was downgraded. The defendant pleaded to simple possession. The mandatory minimum did not apply. A cashier's check for $1,200 was issued the following week to a Maryland LLC named Continental Analytical Consulting Services. The LLC was registered to Holstrop's brother Michael, who had agreed, under what circumstances the federal indictment does not fully specify, to allow his name to be used. The check cleared. Holstrop wrote one line in a composition book in the top drawer of his home office desk. Case identifier, attorney initials, the letter W, the dollar amount, a check mark. The scheme grew the way these schemes grow. R.K. told another defense attorney, a woman the indictment identifies by initials J.M., that there was an analyst in Ashford County who could be relied upon for certain results. J.M. tested the arrangement on a case of her own in the fall of 2019. The substance had been seized as suspected methamphetamine. Holstrop's report identified it as a non-controlled cutting agent, a sugar alcohol that did not appear on any Maryland or federal schedule of controlled substances. The price for that report was $4,000. J.M. paid in cash, dropped in a sealed envelope at a self-storage facility in Towson, where Holstrop maintained a unit under the LLC's name. The case was dismissed at the preliminary hearing. A third attorney joined in early 2020. His initials in the indictment are D.S. He brought volume. By the middle of 2020, the arrangement had stabilized into a tiered pricing structure that Holstrop appears to have communicated to the three attorneys via encrypted email. Weight reductions ran $400 to $1,200. Substance reclassifications, reporting a controlled substance as a non-controlled analog, ran $2,000 to $6,000. The most expensive product was the destroyed sample report, in which Holstrop would document that the seized sample had been consumed in testing or rendered unsuitable for reanalysis. A destroyed sample report ran $8,000 to $14,000. The destroyed sample report was the most operationally damaging product because it meant no future analyst would ever be able to retest what had originally been seized. The mechanism varied case by case. In some cases, he engaged in what the indictment calls selective sampling, testing the least concentrated portion of a heterogeneous seizure and reporting the result as representative of the whole. In other cases, he falsified the documentation outright, signing reports that did not correspond to any analysis he had actually performed. In approximately 240 documented cases, a number arrived at by the eventual forensic audit, he engaged in substance substitution at the sample preparation stage, swapping the seized material for an unrelated substance before any analytical instrument ever recorded a reading. The chain of custody documentation in every single one of these cases was procedurally compliant on its face. He signed every form. He initialed every transfer. He logged every step. The eventual federal prosecutor would call this the most operationally damaging element of the scheme, because it meant the affected case files, on documentary review alone, could not be distinguished from legitimately analyzed files. The paper was clean. The science was not. The signs were there, in the way the signs are always there. His caseload outcomes were statistically improbable. The rate at which his cases produced dismissals or downgrades was, when the federal audit eventually ran the comparison, more than 2 standard deviations above the lab's mean across the period. His destroyed sample reports were 5 times more frequent than the lab average. His name appeared in the discovery files of certain defense attorneys with an unusual concentration. None of these statistical anomalies were tracked in real time. No one was looking for them. The lab's quality control infrastructure had been designed to catch sloppy work, not corrupt work. They were not the same problem. Holstrop bought a used Audi A6 in 2021 with cash. He paid off the mortgage on the Owings Mills townhouse in 2023. He took a 2-week vacation to Iceland that summer with his brother, both flights and the lodge booked through the LLC's accounts. None of it drew the attention of the people who worked beside him every day. He was quiet. He was competent. He went home at 5:30 and did not socialize after hours. The personality the lab had hired in 2017 was exactly the personality that, by 2023, had compromised 1,177 drug cases across 3 counties. He knew the system. He knew the gaps in the system. He knew how to write a chain of custody log that read like an honest log because for 8 years he had read honest logs every day. And he knew that no one was going to test his work because no one tested anyone's work, because the architecture of the institution did not exist to catch what he was doing. That assumption was about to fail. It was going to fail, because one prosecutor in a different building in a federal courthouse downtown asked one question. Stick around for this one. The investigation is about to open up, and what comes next is the part of the story that changes the entire criminal justice landscape of 3 Maryland counties. If you appreciate this kind of accountability coverage, subscribe and hit the bell. We cover institutional corruption cases that most channels never touch. The case that ended Brendan Holstrop's career was not, by the standards of his caseload, an especially remarkable one. It had originated as an Ashford County arrest in the fall of 2024. A defendant stopped on the I-95 corridor with what was eventually documented as approximately 800 grams of a substance the field officers had identified as fentanyl-laced heroin. The quantity was significant. The composition, heroin cut with a synthetic opioid, implicated federal trafficking statutes more directly than state ones. Within 3 weeks of the arrest, the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Maryland had assumed jurisdiction. The state charges were dismissed in favor of federal prosecution. The assistant U.S. attorney handling the case was a 6-year veteran of the district named Andrea Petrosian. She had inherited the file in early November. She read the Ashford County Regional Forensic Laboratory's analytical report, the report that documented the seized substance, identified its composition, and recorded its quantity. The report was signed by Brendan Holstrop. The report was, on its face, procedurally compliant. Petrosian made a routine procedural decision that, in retrospect, every actor in the criminal justice system of 3 Maryland counties would owe a great deal to. She decided to request an independent reanalysis through the Drug Enforcement Administration's Mid-Atlantic Laboratory. Federal trafficking cases involving fentanyl-laced compositions had become, in the post-2020 enforcement environment, the subject of heightened evidentiary scrutiny. Defense attorneys in those cases routinely challenged the original state lab analyses. Petrosian wanted the federal lab's independent verification in the file before she ever filed a motion in court. It was a defensive procedural step. It was not a suspicion. It was a precaution. The DEA Mid-Atlantic Laboratory completed its independent reanalysis in late November. The result was not what the Ashford County report had said. The DEA's report identified a substance composition materially different from the one Holstrop had documented. The federal lab found a different cutting agent ratio, a different fentanyl analog, and a measured weight approximately 90 grams higher than Holstrop's reported figure. The numbers did not approximate each other. They contradicted each other. A discrepancy of that magnitude between 2 accredited laboratories analyzing the same seized material is not an analytical error. It is not a calibration drift. It is not the kind of variance that gets resolved by a phone call between 2 senior chemists. It is a flag. Petrosian flagged it. She referred the discrepancy to the Maryland Attorney General's Public Integrity Section in early December. The Public Integrity Section opened a preliminary inquiry. Within 2 weeks, the preliminary inquiry had escalated. By mid-December, a forensic audit team had been authorized to examine Holstrop's caseload across the preceding 5 years. The audit would retest approximately 240 random samples preserved in the laboratory's evidence retention. The audit was conducted under conditions of strict information control. Holstrop was not told. His colleagues were not told. His supervisor was not told until the audit's preliminary findings were already on the desks of 3 federal prosecutors. The audit ran for 4 months. Brendan Holstrop continued to come to work every day. He continued to sign reports. He continued to write entries in the composition book in his home office. He had no idea the floor had already opened beneath him. The forensic audit's preliminary findings landed on February 17th, 2025. The results were, in the language of the eventual federal indictment, categorically irreconcilable with any explanation other than deliberate analyst misconduct. Of the 240 samples retested, 191 returned analytical results materially inconsistent with Holstrop's original reports. Some of the inconsistencies were modest, weight discrepancies of a few grams, the kind that could plausibly fall within instrument variance. Others were not. In 31 of the retested samples, the substance identified by the reanalysis was a different chemical compound entirely than the substance Holstrop had reported. In 11 cases, the reanalysis identified a Schedule II controlled substance, where Holstrop's original report had identified a non-controlled cutting agent. In 7 cases, the seized sample that Holstrop's original report had declared consumed in testing was found still preserved in the evidence locker, available for analysis, and identified as a controlled substance. The audit had isolated the pattern. The investigation now needed the architecture. A federal grand jury in the District of Maryland was impaneled in late February. Subpoenas issued to 3 banking institutions returned the cash flow records of Continental Analytical Consulting Services, LLC. The LLC's bank account had received approximately $521,400 in deposits between January 2019 and December 2024. The deposits were not from any legitimate consulting client. They were cashier's checks drawn on the operating accounts of 3 Maryland law firms and a series of cash deposits at 3 different bank branches in 3 different counties. The encrypted email archives came next. A federal magistrate judge signed a search warrant for Holstrop's personal devices on February 28th. The execution of that warrant was held in abeyance for 2 weeks while the investigative team coordinated with the Maryland State Bar and the state prosecutors to ensure that the 3 attorney co-conspirators, who were already being separately approached for cooperation agreements, would not be tipped off. 2 of the 3 agreed to cooperate. The encrypted email archive, recovered from a laptop in Holstrop's home office, contained over 400 exchanges with the 3 attorneys spanning the 5-year operating period. The exchanges were unguarded in the way that people are unguarded when they believe their communications cannot be read. RK, so March 14th, 2021. Need a destroyed sample on the Mendoza file. Case number ARK2147. What's the rate? Holstrop. 12-5, half on assignment, half on report filing. RK, done. Drop will be Tuesday at the Towson unit. JM, August 8th, 2022. Cocaine seizure on a 14-year-old defendant going to juvenile court. Needed under 2 grams. ARK 4081. Holstrop, 600, standard terms. DS, January 19th, 2024. Big one, trafficking quantity, fentanyl analog. Needed identified as Schedule 3, RK 6244. What's the number? Holstrop, 8,000. Cash this time, not check. Too many checks this quarter. The exchanges totaled over 1,000 pages when printed. They covered every category of contracted result in the federal indictment's pricing schedule. They were, in the language of the lead prosecutor, a 5-year confession written one email at a time. But the email archive was not the smoking gun. The smoking gun was waiting in a desk drawer. The search warrant on Holstrop's residence was executed at 6:42 a.m. on the morning of March 14th, 2025. 6 federal agents and 2 Maryland State Police troopers approached the front door of the Owings Mills townhouse. Holstrop opened the door in the same worn navy bathrobe over plaid pajama pants. He had not finished his coffee. He read the warrant in the entryway. The lead agent, a special agent from the FBI's Baltimore field office named Reyes, watched his face. The agent's incident report would later describe Holstrop's reaction as unsurprised. The search took 4 hours. Agents recovered the laptop containing the encrypted email archive. They recovered approximately $34,000 in cash, banded in stacks of 1,000, inside a fireproof safe in the master bedroom closet. They recovered the banking records of Continental Analytical Consulting Services, LLC, in a manila file folder labeled Tax Records. They recovered 3 burner phones in a kitchen drawer, and in the top drawer of the desk in the upstairs home office, beneath a separate composition book in which Holstrop had tracked his fantasy football league results in the same hand. They recovered the composition book. Agent Reyes walked Holstrop into the kitchen. He sat him at the small 2-person table by the window. He placed the composition book on the table between them, unopened. "Brendan," Reyes said, "we're going to talk about this book." Holstrop looked at the book. He looked up at the agent. He looked at the front door of his own house, where 2 more federal agents were standing. "I want a lawyer." "That's your right. I want a lawyer." "You've already said it. You don't have to say it again." Holstrop did not say it again. He did not say anything else at all. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands flat on his thighs and watched the agents finish their inventory of the home he had paid off in cash. At 11:14 a.m., he was placed in handcuffs and walked out the front door of the townhouse in his bathrobe, slippers, and pajama pants. A neighbor across the cul-de-sac watched from her bay window. The neighbor would tell a Baltimore Sun reporter later that week that he had always seemed like such a quiet man. He was. The federal indictment was unsealed at the U.S. District Court for the District of Maryland on the afternoon of March 14, 2025. The document ran 63 pages. The charging counts were extensive. 1 count of obstruction of justice under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1503. 1 count of tampering with evidence under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1512. 18 counts of wire fraud under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1343. 9 counts of money laundering under 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1956, and 1 count under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, 18 U.S.C., paragraph 1962C, the federal statute originally drafted to dismantle organized criminal enterprises. A parallel state indictment was filed in the Maryland Circuit Court the same afternoon. The state counts included tampering with physical evidence under Maryland criminal law, paragraph 9307, perjury under paragraph 91001 related to the falsified analyst affidavits Holstrop had executed across hundreds of prosecutions, and an aggregated theft count under paragraph 7104. Holstrop was arraigned the following morning. He pleaded not guilty to every count. The presiding magistrate set bond at $100,000 with conditions: immediate suspension from any laboratory or forensic science function, surrender of his American Board of Criminalistics certification, and a prohibition on entry to the Ashford County Regional Forensic Laboratory facility. His brother Michael posted the bond by the end of the afternoon. Holstrop walked out of the federal courthouse at 4:48 p.m. that day in a borrowed suit. He has not returned to the laboratory since. Trial is pending. As of this episode's broadcast date, no sentence has been imposed and no verdict has been returned. The lead federal prosecutor, Andrea Petrosian, the same assistant U.S. attorney whose single procedural decision to request a federal reanalysis had begun the unraveling, has been assigned to the trial team. The federal defense bar in the District of Maryland has not produced a public theory of the defense, but the case Brendan Holstrop will eventually stand trial on is not the most operationally significant consequence of what he did. The most operationally significant consequence is the consequence the Maryland Office of the Public Defender's Forensics Review Unit has been working on full-time since the first preliminary audit results emerged in February. Approximately 1,412 drug analysis cases were compromised across the 5-year operating period of the scheme. Approximately 740 of those compromised analyses produced reports that were entered into evidence in active prosecutions, meaning 740 defendants pleaded guilty, were convicted at trial, or are currently in active proceedings premised on analytical findings the state of Maryland now concedes cannot be relied upon. The Forensics Review Unit has identified 180 defendants in active state custody whose convictions rest in whole or substantial part on Holstrop's analyses. As of mid-April, all 180 have been released from custody pending reanalysis. The reanalysis, in many cases, will not be possible because the seized samples, in cases where Holstrop documented them as consumed in testing, do not exist to be retested. The lead public defender on the Forensics Review Unit's coordinating committee, a senior assistant public defender named Yasmin Ortega, gave a statement at the bond hearing that has been quoted in nearly every print account of the case. She said, "What this analyst did is not a self-contained crime. It is a 5-year erosion of the evidentiary foundation of every drug prosecution in 3 Maryland counties. The state is now in the position of having to confess error to 740 defendants, their families, the victims of the underlying offenses where there were victims, and the taxpayers of this state. We will be doing this work for years, and in cases where the original sample no longer exists, we will never be able to do it fully." The 3 attorney co-conspirators were charged separately. 2 of the 3 accepted cooperation agreements. The 3rd is contesting the charges. The State Bar of Maryland has initiated disciplinary proceedings against all 3, including suspensions of their licenses to practice law in the state, pending resolution. The Ashford County Regional Forensic Laboratory has been placed under independent monitorship by the Maryland Attorney General's Office. Every drug analysis case handled by the laboratory in the preceding 10 years is being administratively flagged for review. The laboratory's accreditation has been provisionally suspended. The laboratory's director resigned in late March. The 2 senior analysts who shared the bench with Holstrop have been placed on administrative leave pending the conclusion of an internal misconduct review that is not focused on their own work, but on whether they ever observed conduct that should have prompted a report. There was a notebook. There was always going to be a notebook. The investigator who eventually presented it at the preliminary hearing called it a forensic case roster, organized as a personal accounting record in the hand of the analyst responsible for the analyses. He had kept it in the same drawer as the notebook in which he tracked his fantasy football league. He had written in both books in the same hand. He had thought on some level that did not extend to imagining the moment in which a federal agent would actually place it on a kitchen table in front of him, that the line between the two books was a line only he would ever see. It was not. The translation of physical evidence into legally cognizable fact is supposed to happen in a room where the only loyalty is to what the substance actually is. Brendan Holstrop took that room and sold what happened inside it, one case at a time, to a small network of attorneys who knew exactly what they were buying. 740 prosecutions now carry a permanent asterisk. 180 defendants are home. Many of those defendants will never face the underlying charges again because the evidence that would have been used against them has been compromised beyond any possibility of repair. What ended it was one prosecutor in a different building asking one question. This case was disturbing, but the case right here might be the most outrageous betrayal of public trust we've ever covered. Click it now.